Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jamie, for that really kind introduction, and thank you to Alex and everyone at the seminar for organising this really fascinating series of lectures. And I hope that we can make a small contribution to that. So yeah, I just wanted to say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, for wherever you are joining us from. I can see it's a really wide range of people. Um, I'm Jessica, and as Jamie just said, I'm here in my capacity as I work at the British International Research Institutes. And you'll find that a few of our colleagues also on the call. I think I saw Eleni and Alice joining, so there'll be a broader number of us if you did have questions to put our heads together and answer later. So what are the British International Research Institutes? It's a bit of a mouthful. If we can go on to the next slide, please. So they were initially founded in the 19th and 20th centuries as archaeological excavation headquarters and training schools. You'll see some of the logos of the different institutes there, but they now focus on arts, humanities, and the social sciences. And then on to the next one as well. Thank you. Um, the institutes hold archival collections that cover the Mediterranean, Turkey, and the Black Sea, northeastern and southern Africa, as well as the Middle East, Iran, and Central Asia. And not surprisingly, many of these include significant Islamic collections. I think it's fair to say that in the imperial heyday of the institutes, these weren't necessarily the focus of the knowledge that was produced then and there, but they did end up with archives relating to Islamic architecture, ended up being created, donated, or left at these institutes, where they're now in the hands of archivists who are very interested in preserving and prioritizing those collections, as well as sharing them with the world. And so they've created some of these digital archives that you can see on the slide here. Next slide, please. That said, there are often some pretty major issues going from having an Islamic archival collection to making it available online for researchers such as yourselves. Often archivists work alone and they're tasked with huge collections. It would be impossible to digitize, describe, and publish online in their working lifetimes if they were left alone to do that. So how could this be done differently? Well, a couple of the enterprising archivists at the British Institute at Ankara and the British School at Rome got together and they said, what could be achieved if we use structured data and machine learning to link our collection descriptions together? Would that be the silver bullet, allowing us to completely automate description? Probably not, but it could allow the institutes with differing amounts of time and expertise to make significant leaps towards getting a more diverse set of collections online. It definitely could. So the results that we'll explore today, with a special focus on this particular collaborative project and how it's improving description of Islamic architectural collections from Benghazi to Gaza via Somalia, and I hope that will be of interest to you all. Before I go into the technical weeds, and I promise you there won't be too many photos of spreadsheets, and there will be lots of photos of gorgeous Islamic architecture, particularly when David and Anne-Marie get started. Can I just have a little bit of a show of hands from the people we have in attendance? Are you able to put your hands up or make any kind of reaction? I think so. I hope so. Let's see. So if I asked, can everyone who's heard of machine learning put your hand up or make a kind of reaction? Yes, okay, I've got a couple of coming through there. Fantastic. What about FAIR principles? Do those mean anything to you? Findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. Maybe a few more. It's hard to tell which ones are coming up for. Oh, maybe not. It seems to be going down. What about linked open data? This is a really key one for us. All right, okay. A few very positive, some hearts. Okay, so there's a bit of a mixture. We've got roughly just under 40 of us here, and maybe 5 was the maximum of reactions that I saw there. So it kind of gives you a sense of there's definitely an awareness of these things, but what do they actually mean when it comes to the research that we're passionate about? Well, if I go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So could you explain linked open data? Give a definition if that wasn't there on the screen. Don't worry, that's the end of the interactive part of the talk. I won't put you on the spot again. But essentially, here it is. Linked open data is a method of structuring and connecting data to create meaningful networks of information. So when the data is published in a structured format, its descriptive metadata is then linked and enriched, making it easier to discover different representations of the same content and make links between related resources. So what does all this mean for you as the user, as the researcher? Well, it enhances searchability by adding semantic context to images and documents, allowing for more precise and more meaningful search results. Who doesn't want that, right? More than that, it also allows us to establish relationships that could provide a more complete understanding and unveil hidden qualities and characteristics, which can fuel and answer new research questions. And last but not least, especially relevant for our work today, it broadens access to certain types of cultural heritage and improves their visibility. Next slide, please. So since 2022, the British Academy, the UK's foremost funder of social and sciences and humanities research, the BIRI have been working together to adopt these linked open data standards and methodologies in order to identify those links between their collections, with the eventual aim of developing a joint portal. So by connecting archives across disparate locations from Rome to Ankara, we'll provide an academic resource that moves beyond traditional area studies boundaries. This could be connecting collections across modern day institutional boundaries that then lead to a better understanding of the Islamic world, how it was constituted throughout its history from the 7th century all the way to the 20th or 21st even. And the good news is you don't have to wait until the final portal is created. We'll actually be publishing 2 interactive stories showcasing some of these links in March. So follow our socials, we'll share them on the last slide. Next slide, please. In preparing some of these stories, we recently mapped the locations that pioneering women archaeologists who were connected across our archives have been to across the world. So, you can see a lot of blue pins popping up. It's giving British Empire. But anyway, there are still some challenges. The standardized data sets and scraping tools that allow us to make these connections and then present them in such a way are really lacking or even non-existent for regions outside of Europe. Next slide, please. So here's the spreadsheet that we used to generate that map on the previous slide, and it's populated using something called a taxonomy, which is a list essentially of known place names. But there's something wrong. If you go to the next slide, you'll see quite a blank spreadsheet. And that's because what I've done here is filter out to show those places that have essential data missing, things like coordinates that would allow you to then present that on the map. Almost all of those entries relate to places in the Middle East and in Africa. Next slide, please. So there are some challenges, and I'm sure many of these will be familiar to you as searchers of digital systems for for your own research. So there are challenges in the sort of Anglo-centric nature of digital humanities as a field, and that's often built into the software systems themselves. So on the right, we see the British Institute of Libya and North African Studies catalogue record, which includes some description in Arabic. But even getting to that stage was really difficult because the system doesn't accommodate languages other than English. And even though our colleague Ahmed Bouzain prepared and manually entered it and really, went to trouble to try and make this happen, you can see the alignment still isn't quite right. So there's a real barrier to access for Libyan heritage agencies and the communities whose heritage this comes from. And this is in a kind of proprietary software format. But there are also some challenges within even open source software. So you see on the left-hand side, the Levant BIRI that I'll be talking about a bit more later was able to include Arabic within its software, but that was greatly made possible by support from another BIRI, the one at Ankara in Turkey, because essentially they shared their open source software architecture. We were allowed to clone it and save years of work, which meant that they were able to dedicate more time and ultimately more resources, more money towards that Arabic language capability. They were also able to share things like keywords and descriptive categories that also improves and makes more efficient this kind of work, which I'll go into a bit later. So this is where collaboration between the institutes outside of Europe can have a real and lasting impact. So over to you, David. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Next slide, please. There we go.
Thank you, Jessica, for that nice presentation. So my name is David, and I want to talk a bit about the British Institute, Eastern Africa. So for us, we were founded around 1959, and that was just when most of countries in the Eastern Africa region were getting their independence, or get independence around early 1960s. And our archive, our institute initially wanted to do research that is connected with the later African archaeology. And the reason for that is because there was some research that was going on in the Eastern Africa region, but mainly concentrated on the human evolution. So the institute felt that maybe they can come and do something concerning the people, the history of people in the Eastern Africa region, and also the later African archaeology. So the archive, what we have is the research that have been happening since 1960s to present. And what is happening right now is that we have been digitizing, and some of it is stored by an archaeological data service. But that's simply a small part. Some of it, it is in our physical archive in Nairobi, but we continue to help researchers who are interested. When they email us, we are able to give them materials that they need. Next slide, please. So one of the research that was carried out by the British Institute is about Swahili civilization. And when I talk about Swahili civilization, this was simply city-states that stretched from Somalia all the way to Mozambique along Eastern Africa region. And in the case of the Swahili civilization is that it began around 2,000 years ago. And that has been captured by early writings, for example, around the 1st century. We have Pericles of Erythraean Sea, which was written by a Roman Egyptian geographer. And also we have another written record around 4th century, which is named Geography of Ptolemy. But when we talk about Islamic civilization, which is part of this session, is that Islam spread in the East Africa region around 8th century. And Kilwa, which was established around 10th century, formed part of those city-states. Although they had an African origin, they was highly influenced by Islamic culture. And one of the unique things about Kilwa as a city-state that it was visited by the great Moroccan explorer in around 1332, Bin Battuta, and he described it as one of the most beautiful cities. So when you think about Battuta and some of the places that he had visited, and then he's able to put Kilo in that same level, it means it was quite a magnificent city. Next page. This is what we call, this is one of the remaining ruins, architectural ruins at Kilwa at present, which is now in present day and Tanzania. And it's one of the oldest, built around 11th century. And when you see the architecture of that building, is that it has those dome-shaped, which now shows you the interlinkages between East Africa region and North Africa, because this is something that they borrowed from Fatimids, culture, architectural designs, and then they borrowed it and brought it to East Africa region. Next page, please. Okay, some of the collections, I just wanted to show you a sketch of the site when the site was being excavated in 1960s, which forms some of the collections that we have, including the field materials and other and photographs that we have at our collection. But this is online, but others which are not online, they are also in our archive. So I'm encouraging researchers who are interested in this to visit our archive, which is online, also to contact us for the same. Next page, please. So when you think about the dome design, was also borrowed from Fatmid, and it is also part of Kilwa, which also shows those interconnections that existed at that period. Next page. And this is very interesting because now this is part of the mausoleum inscription that was done on the mausoleum of the Sultan of Kilwa. And when you think about Prophet Muhammad and the way he had argued about concerning having simple burial strategy in a way that they were not supposed to invest so much in creating, investing on architecture concerning burials and stuff like that. And then when you connect to this, which now I think this was borrowed from Baghdad, from Abbasidi, and then it came to the region. So another evidence that shows that interconnection that existed between East Africa and the greater Islamic world. Next. Beside that collection, I also wanted to talk about Somalia. And the reason I wanted to talk about Somalia is because for a long time, over 3 decades, Somalia had conflict. And that conflict, what has happened is that a lot of architectural buildings have been destroyed. Others have been renovated. But what has happened is that some of the things that we have at in our archive, they are very unique. And the reason they are unique is because they were recorded. And these photos were taken before the conflict erupted in Somalia in 1990. And one of the unique things about Somali architectural buildings is those inscriptions, which shows, which are no longer in existence, but at least we have those photographs connected with those architectural designs that existed at the period, and which were borrowed from other places beside Arabic Peninsula, also from Syria and other places in the Islamic world. Next page. This is the same dome or the roof of the mosque, and which when you analyze the architectural designs in East Africa, it goes away all the way from Mogadishu, going to Kenya and also to Tanzania. And this shows the interconnection that existed, because the same technique is what has been used in Kilwa and also in other city-states which have not yet put photos for this presentation. Next, please. And this is a general view of the Jama, one of the most famous mosques in Mogadishu. This was just before the war in the early 1970s. Next page, please. When we talk about using linked open data, is that this, I believe, is going to give us a lot of visibility, especially for researchers, because there's some people who study other regions, not necessarily in West Africa, but they don't know that these data exist. And when you analyze Islamic landscape in terms of their history, you see even their famous geographers and historians visiting the region, the East Africa region, which shows it was a very important part of the Islamic world. So when you combine this data that exists and you connect with other data in other places like North Africa, Arabia, Persia, and Syria, it can help to create a holistic picture of Islamic influence in this region and also beyond. Next page. So thank you so much. I invite Anne-Marie to continue.
Okay, thank you very much, David. And as Jimmy mentioned earlier in her very lovely introduction, thank you. I'm Anne-Marie, and I'm the archivist for the British Institute for Libyan and Northern African Studies, which thankfully we often shorten to BILNAS. And BILNAS promotes scholarship on the archaeology, history, environment and culture of Libya and the wider Northern Africa region. So next slide, please. Central to this mission is the BILNAS archive, which holds historically significant material which primarily documents British-led archaeological projects in Libya since the Second World War and onwards. Next slide, please. So our records include materials from excavations at Hellenistic and Roman sites in Libya, like Benghazi, like Berenice, Serene, and Lepsis Magna and Sabratha. It also preserves material from groundbreaking multidisciplinary surveys in the pre-desert valleys of Tripolitania and the Saharan oasis of Fezzan, as well as excavations at Islamic Barqa, El Merj, and Medinet Sultan. Next slide, please. So BILNAS has furthered this focus on Islamic archaeology through major excavations at the Fatimid towns of Al-Shtabia and Sirte, as well as through the careful excavation of later Islamic phases in the coastal classical cities of, and forgive me my pronunciation, I was practicing earlier, but I think you say Ptolemais, I think. Leptith, Magnus, Abratha, Tokra, and Berenice. And here on this screen, I've shared one of our photographs, actually, from the Al-Shtabia excavation, which was directed by David Whitehouse in the 1970s. And this is the site that was excavated, and that's the Jami Sanun Mosque in Al-Shtabia. Next slide, please. So from these various excavations are preserved, the material from these excavations, are preserved in remarkable catalogues of objects, inscriptions, and detailed kind of architectural descriptions of palatial sites, of mosques, of cemeteries, and of fortifications, alongside maps, plans, drawings, illustrations, and photographs. And I wanted to share these three images because I think they show like a lovely trajectory of the types of material that we have. So in the first image, we have a capital from the Antonine Temple in Sabratha. And a capital is basically the decorative or part of a column. And then in the next image, the second image then, is an illustration of that capital that was taken at the site. And then thirdly, the third image is the plan that goes along, which is where the capital was recovered from as part of the excavation. This is a fabulous, obviously historically significant collection, but similar to David's situation with Somalia, civil wars in Libya in 2011 and then again from 2014 to 2020 have placed many of these heritage sites at risk, with Islamic mosques and tombs obviously affected. So consequently, the records that we preserve here in the BILNAS archive, they often serve as the only surviving or accessible documentation of these at-risk heritage sites. There are, of course, additional threats that all heritage sites face, such as urban development and climate change, and this heightens this risk of loss. So given these threats, we have to ask ourselves, how do we facilitate access to the records that we do have, which in many cases are the only existing records documenting these heritage sites? And next slide, please. So what we at BILNAS have done with the support of the British Academy is to initiate a digitisation programme in the first instance. And apologies for those that are familiar with the process, but I thought I would explain that it is a two-step process that starts with converting our analogue materials to digital form, so our maps, our plans, our illustrations, and so forth. And secondly, this was our choice, we deposited these digital resources with the Archaeological Data Service, the ADS, and that's the UK's leading accredited repository for archaeology and historic environment data. So once we deposited with the ADS, the digital objects, as they're known, become publicly accessible via the ADS website. At the moment, we have our collections from Sabratha available. By February, we will have our collections from Gerza available, and by March, we should have, fingers crossed, our collections from Al-Shtabia and from the UNESCO Libyan Valleys Survey available for access. But these digitisation efforts have been further strengthened through collaboration with other BIRIs on the development of linked open data. So next slide, please. And at the risk of repeating what Jessica has already so finally outlined, linked open data integrates existing data sets with an agreed, using an agreed or standardized data model and links them to authority records in platforms such as Wikidata. So just a quick example then, if you were to search for materials on the Fatimid Palace in Al-Shtabia within the BILNAS catalogue, which is available online, you would find a link then to records in the Heritage Gazetteer of Libya. So this interconnected approach, it not only standardizes access points and contextual information, But as David and Jessica have said, it really facilitates that cross-collection search because you're using the same terms and you're coming across the same records. And that really enhances any follow-up research. So those are the efforts that BILNAS are making to try and make their collections and materials more publicly accessible, particularly for source communities based in Libya and for the diaspora community as well. Next slide, please. So just in my, just to try and wrap up the section then for BILNAS, I wanted to just highlight an article that was written by Corisande Fenwick, who was the former president of BILNAS until very recently, until December. She is a professor of late antique and Islamic archaeology. And she made this observation in an article about Islamic archaeology. She claimed that North Africa played a pivotal role in the development of Islamic archaeology as a discipline. And since the 1990s, there has been a significant rise in the number of projects and amount of evidence available, as well as a new interest in revisiting old questions and models for the Islamic period. And it is our hope that through our archival collections and through our efforts to make these collections more publicly accessible, that we will continue to contribute in meaningful ways to this expanding field of research and ensure the preservation and the accessibility of Libya's rich Islamic heritage for future generations. And I'm going to hand over now to Jessica. I think she's going to move on to the Levant area.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Anne-Marie, and thank you so much, David. I was almost relaxing and enjoying the talk and learning these fascinating things from colleagues. And that's kind of the point we're trying to make here, I suppose. It takes us outside of the areas we know well. So for me, the Levant and the Mediterranean, and brings us into contact with other areas of the world which would have been more connected in the period we study. So similarly, the archives of the Council for British Research in the Levant, the British Institute at Ankara, and even the British schools at Athens and Rome include important records of Islamic architecture, some of which also suffer from threats from conflict and climate change related erasure. Here also the standardization of archival description across the institutes would then help make the digitized collections accessible online faster. And so, for example, on the screen we have here some examples from CBRL, so the Levant BIRI's collections, which include rare books and archives of historical significance documenting the history, geography, archaeology, and cultural heritage generally of Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Sudan, and Egypt. And I'm just going to talk briefly about one survey that was conducted by this institute as an example. So from the late 1960s, CBRL conducted a survey of the old city of Jerusalem, Al-Quds, including Ayyubid, Mamluk, and Ottoman buildings and monuments, so stretching from the 12th to the 20th century, many of which are now under threat for obvious reasons I'm sure everyone here is aware of. The architects started with some reference photographs taken by K.A.C. Cresswell in the 1920s and 30s, and then returned to the same spots to document the buildings using the most up-to-date technology of the time, recording accurate measurements, and then producing map, plan, and axonometric and section drawings, as well as new photographs showing changes in condition, as well as documenting the architecture. They were supported by Palestinian colleagues and also given unprecedented access to the interiors of many of these private buildings or private residencies within these older buildings. And the efforts of this culminated in the publication of the Islamic Jerusalem Trilogy, which is the 3 seminal reference works on those periods, so Mamluk, Ayyubid, and Ottoman architecture, as you can see on the right-hand side. 3 of those 4 volumes have now been digitized and available open access from JSTOR, and we'll be linking at the end to CBRL's JSTOR page. And while this is absolutely laudable, many photographs, drawings, and survey notes remain unpublished, which is a problem because a survey like this would be very difficult to conduct today. So getting the older survey material online for researchers globally is of significance. If we go on to the next slide, please. What we do have is a small online exhibit that highlights some of the aspects of the collection, as you can see on the left. And then on the right, we have Dr. Yusuf Netche, who is the author of the Architectural Survey for the Ottoman Jerusalem publication, shared some of his recollections of the project and its significance, both then and today, available on YouTube. Next slide, please. So working together allows us to combat the Anglo-centric biases within the digital humanities field. So even from the particularities of our specific position as ex-colonial knowledge production centres based in the global north predominantly. So linking collections allows us to take the sort of minor parts of well-developed archives such as those at Ankara, Athens and Rome, and bridge these with some of the smaller British research institutes for whom the Islamic architecture is a larger and more important part of their collections, such as my colleagues at the Eastern Africa, North Africa, and even the Levant and Iran institutes. So these links can simply, but perhaps best, be located within the most obvious fragments across the collections that relate to famous sacred architecture. So what might not appear to amount to much and might honestly be best described as sort of early tourist snaps can actually become instilled with greater significance when global conflicts are played out on the local stage, meaning that some of the most famous architectures are all too often damaged and occasionally, obviously, as we've seen in the past year, tragically destroyed. So by linking these collections, that means that the metadata that gives meaning to what is depicted within these photographs to non-specialists and expert alike, we can then address the digital gap in the accessibility of archives on Islamic art and architecture mentioned earlier in comparison to the European documentation. So, for example, the Ankara Institute and the British School at Rome have not yet digitized much of their collections on Islamic civilizations, but because the Levant Institute has dedicated its recent efforts in that area, they're then able to share a metadata schema that then could allow a route for those other collections to become available to yourselves as researchers much faster. And this was also supported recently by a library digitization project at CBRL, the Levant Institute, supported by the British Library Endangered Archives Programme. And then you should be able to see at the bottom right there, it's a little bit small, the publication from the Mandate Palestine era on the mosaics of the Dome of the Rock at Jerusalem and the Great Mosque of Damascus, which is photographed here from the other institutes by Marguerite van Berchem, translated by KAC Crespel. If you recall, that's the person whose reference photographs the surveyors were using. So there are these kind of networks related. If we can move on to the next slide, please. Similarly, the British School at Athens holds a collection of architectural drawings, photographs and notebooks from the late 19th century to the mid-20th century, which include Ottoman architecture, and that's called the Byzantine Research Fund. And in some cases, this collection contains the only record of a monument before its destruction. As you can see here, we've got an image of the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul from 1890, which was obviously then converted to the Hagia Sophia Mosque in 1453. And a comparison with the British Institute Ankara collection on the right-hand side. If we move on to the next slide, please. And this seminar, to be honest, prompted us to start asking questions amongst our colleagues. You know, do you have any collections of Islamic architecture that we're not aware of? And we had some unexpected responses from the British School at Rome. Their archivist, Alessandro Giovenco, told us that they also had a small but important collection documenting places and events in Palestine, Sinai and Italy during the First World War, which belonged to Captain Francis Reynold Rodd, son of the former British ambassador to Rome, who photographed Islamic architecture and daily life across Palestine from Gaza to Jerusalem between approximately 1910 and 1920. Now, these obviously include the expected, view from my tent, so-and-so on a donkey, so-and-so having tea, of a sort of British imperial officer abroad that I'm sure you're familiar with. But they also include interesting evidence of significant international forces stationed there, the Italian and French officers, the armoured cars in Hebron, the Turkish and British wells and police points. But there's something of an accidental testament to the interconnectedness of places in historic and occupied Palestine that might be of interest today. Next slide, please. Rodd photographed not just Islamic architecture, such as the Great Omari Mosque in Gaza City, as you can see on the right, and the mosque in Khan Yunis, but aspects of daily life that subvert the stereotypes of some of these places, recently most associated with news of bombardment and destruction, with those of joyful, intangible heritage, such as, I think this is on the next slide, actually. So, Deir el-Balah's village beach. And at the moment, obviously, I'm only able to show you, with one exception, excerpts from a handwritten list of captions rather than the photographs themselves, which gives you an indication of what is available online and what isn't digitized, the kind of gaps and lacuna that we're talking about. But this is due to the amount of time that researching accurate captions and other descriptive data, such as the date, the location, the creator, the copyright status, and the realistic limitations on staff time, as well as the ability to locate sort of out of region expertise. And we're lucky to say that a British School at Rome fellow, Mariam Ghulam Hussain, is researching these images and will be providing more descriptions soon, so do kind of follow along. Now, the Shared Archive portal aims to address this issue by connecting collections such as these with other archives across the network that specialize in that material, using that perennial linked open data. And now, for example, we could connect these images to CBRL's, the Levant Institute's 4,000 digitized archival records from historic and occupied Palestine and its 98 digitized rare books, significantly speeding up the rate at which these sorts of collections can be digitized and then made accessible for researchers globally, such as yourself, to reuse them and create new meanings, whether in practical restoration projects at destroyed monuments in Gaza, or through bringing to life new comparisons between other Islamic centers across history, as David and Marie have been indicating. So finally, next slide, please. I'd like to conclude by saying that we've attempted to show off some of the possibilities for connections and building solidarities across the British institutes that have the access to the technical and also financial resources of the global north, but hold collections of histories of significance to the global south. And this, we really feel that by making these archives accessible more quickly, this could help to overcome some of the inequities built into the academic system, at least at the archival level, helping to overcome barriers presented by visa requirements or prohibitive travel costs. We hope that you've enjoyed this sort of whirlwind tour across the medieval Islamic world, and we hope that you found out about a collection you didn't know existed that just might be the missing link for your research. Talking of links, here are some terribly unvisually appealing links, but they've got a lot of information in them, and hopefully some of them have been appearing in the chat. So thank you very much, Jamie. And if we could go to the final slide, please. Oh, second to last, sorry. This is our social medias, if you're more of a Twitter or Instagram person. And then on to the last one. Thank you. So these are our email addresses. Please do get in touch with any inquiries. Obviously, researcher interest is one of the metrics that helped us advocate for funding for digitization and spending time on these collections. So if you're interested, please don't be shy. Thank you very much.